500 and growing.
Podcast.
Dedicated to the underdog, cause I see you. Working on your craft, getting strong, cause I see you. Ready to set it off and on, cause I see you. Correcting all that is wrong, cause I see you.
All right. Hello, everybody in the virtual world. My name is Jesus Azteca 500 Sanchez. I'm the host of the 500 and Growing podcast. And today we have Jessica Juarez. Jessica is somebody that has been definitely inspirational in my life because I have seen her grow. I have seen her really dedicate herself to community. She is the spearhead of the Venus Collective, which was an all-woman event. Anything that had anything to do with that event was led by women, and that was really, really beautiful. It was an incredible event. The other thing that she's doing now is she has started the Praxis Institute and then Kindred. Kindred is something that I've participated in. Jessica has a background in psychology and therapy, so she's doing this melding of there's art therapy, but also it's not so formal and it's part of the community, and I'm really inspired by her. And so everybody, welcome Jessica Juarez. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you.
To the 500 and Growing podcast. So Jessica and I met through my partner, which is one of her good friends. So Jessica, how would you describe your childhood? What was your childhood like?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for, inviting me. It's an honor to be a part of this. But I was born in Guatemala City, and I was there till about 7 years old. And I would describe my childhood in Guatemala as, it was like joyous childhood. A lot of, if I can picture it, I just remember my sister and my cousins and neighborhood kids kind of like playing around, laughing and whatnot. So I would say that for the most part in Guatemala, my childhood was really happy. However, it didn't come with any struggles. In my house, I lived actually with my grandmother, my uncles, and my aunt. And they, there was a lot of secrecy in the family, lack of boundaries, generational trauma, substance abuse. So, and I didn't realize that would affect me, or I guess I didn't realize the impact of that until I was older. But, just remembering my childhood, those are the two things that I remember in Guatemala. Now, coming to Chicago when I was 7, that seemed like a really hard time in my life, too. Again, while you're going through it, you don't realize the impact it has on you. But yeah, coming to another country, we moved in with another family with other cousins. And yeah, not to go too deep into it, but it was a continuation of different traumas, of substance abuse as well, and just a lot of abuse in general. Mm-hmm. So, again, I would say like my childhood was laughter and joy, but then coupled with just a lot of heavy, intense stuff,
Yeah, and one thing that must have been very traumatic as a kid is to come at 7, right?
Yeah.
And to come to the United States, not speak the language, and have to acclimate yourself and assimilate to this culture. Like, what was that like for you?
That was tough in some ways. Like for me, I was a very introverted child. So learning something for me was to observe. So I observed how people moved. I observed not only their languages and like their verbal language, just their body language. But I was a very quiet child. So that was a little rough for me to learn it. Fortunately, though, I enrolled in a bilingual school.
Nice.
So, and my teacher was Guatemalan.
Ooh, yeah. Double connection.
It was. So I think, in the education system in Guatemala, I was a lot more advanced than a lot of people. Like I knew how to write my name, stuff like that, where people were coming. Well, actually, I was put a grade back because I didn't know how to speak English in a bilingual school.
Yeah.
But I was a little more advanced as far as like writing your name and whatnot. So I did learn pretty fast. And I always give the credit to Sesame Street.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Sesame Street really taught me a lot of English.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, to give flowers to that teacher that was Guatemalan in school, like, what was she like? Like, what were the encounters that you remember with her that kind of changed your life? Because when you mentioned her, I saw, like, your spirit kind of lift.
Yeah. So I didn't really have, in the long run, like a big connection with her. It was just more of the Guatemalan connection. And I don't really have very many memories of her. Just the initial, like, okay,
like I feel
sigh of
welcomed
relief of like, oh, someone who is Guatemalan,
and
you
can
know what I mean?
understand where I'm coming from.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Where did you live in Chicago when you were here? Like, where did you grow up?
Sure.
And what was Chicago like in the area that you were growing up in?
Sure. So I've lived in so many places in Chicago, but coming from Guatemala, we actually lived in Rogers Park, in the Ravenswood area. That was the first place that I remember. And we lived there maybe, I'm trying to remember, like maybe 3 years before we lived by Clark and Devon, around that area. So I grew up in Rogers Park.
Okay. And so, I mean, I imagine that place to be like a quiet area, no? Or
it was for the most part. Like when I lived in Arthur, and that was the street, it was pretty residential. Like there are some neighborhood kids, so I would be able to play around with them. But, I wasn't allowed to like go to the store. And if I did, I had to have someone with me because, there were still some rough parts in the neighborhood. I wasn't aware of them, but there were rough parts in the neighborhood.
Okay. What was it like to be raised by, so you were raised by a single mom?
I was raised by a single mom.
What was it being raised by a single mom coming from Guatemala? Like your mom had to have had like an immense amount of courage because you have your 3 sisters, right?
Yeah.
You're one of 3.
Yeah.
You're the oldest?
I'm the middle child.
You're the middle child. Okay.
Yeah.
And so for your mom to have the courage to be like, yo, I'm gonna go to the United States and then realize the social ladder, the hierarchy here in the United States that's not friendly to immigrants at all.
Right.
What was that like? And give your mom flowers too, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
your mom's a badass.
She really is. I have a few answers to that because, yes, my mom did raise me alone. But as you were speaking, I was kind of thinking about it. I've always lived in a household full of people. So like I mentioned, growing up in Guatemala, we lived in a pretty, spacious house where I lived with, I want to say like 7 or 8 people. So while she raised me alone, I was always surrounded by others. So when she wasn't around, I had, other adults or whatnot. And the same thing when I came to Chicago. There was a lot of people around me. It wasn't probably until I was in high school that I lived alone with my sister and my just one aunt and my little sister. But I, and I say that because it's very communal now that I'm thinking about it. I was always surrounded by community in my family. But I know it was rough for her. I think that, to your point, I think she had to play various roles for me as well with, she was growing up with us. I could say that, you know what I mean? And was doing the best that she could with what she had. And the way that we came to Chicago was 2 of my aunts already lived here. So they, from what I understand, kind of inspired her to make the move because there's people here already, right? So it wasn't like, I'm just going to go to Chicago.
What it's like too.
Yeah. It wasn't like I'm going to Chicago. It was to go from one family household to another in another country. But I know that had to be hard for her because she had to leave her livelihood to come, with that whole like American dream of building a better life for us and for herself. But she did have that, like you said, that inner knowing and also hearing it from my aunts of how things were over here. But my mom has always been grounded by love. That's one of the things that she will always say is like, I couldn't have given you all these material things, but I did give you love. And with that love, though, there were those hard moments, of discipline, so to speak, of having those really tough rules that, again, you don't really know the impact of it until you're older. And in the moment, it might feel harsh, but I understood eventually when my relationship with my mom got better and better, that I was able to separate her from being my mother to a human being, doing the best that she could.
For sure. How did you mend that relationship?
It was a tough road, you know. I think it ebbed and flowed, and it wasn't a linear road. It was very tumultuous. I think when I was growing up, I saw my mom. I believe like every person, you idolize them, right? They're your everything, you know. And I had that for a really long time. I saw her as this goddess, which she is. But there comes a point where you start, waking up and you see these flaws and you see the impact of some of their actions and their behavior. Yeah, and then I became really angry at her. We have very strong personalities, both of us. So I think most of the time I'm very opinionated and she is too. And we clashed a lot. You know, my teenage years were really rough because we just did not see eye to eye. And I was really angry. And she was angry at me too. You know, we were growing together. And I think that's something really interesting that happens with that developmental lifespan where she was growing into, a different period. And I was also, right, where I'm becoming adult and I'm no longer the child. But we're going through it at the same time.
Yeah,
It's really tough, nobody's right and nobody's wrong type of thing.
Yeah.
And then I think once I started going to therapy, probably, I started realizing, and I did a lot of inner child work also, where I just began to learn to mother myself, and think of mother in a bigger level and not just put that whole thing on just one person. And with that, like, inner child work, I was able to see her for a human being. And then, my mom had a really rough, she was a very rough upbringing.
Yeah.
So once I started being like, man, with that upbringing, she was still able to raise these, powerful and strong women, and she has been able to maintain and do all the things that she has done. You start gaining all that respect for her. But I think we had to have a really transformative conversation where I was able to speak to her about all of the impact of her actions. And she was able to speak on the same. And I think we finally had a breakthrough. And it's so interesting because we had it in a restaurant. And I remember both of us bawling and people being like, oh my God, can I get you some water? Like, and it was a really beautiful, time that we had. And after that, it was very tender, right? Like, we were vulnerable. So we didn't speak to each other for a minute. But once we she apologized, I apologized. Yeah. And we started transforming our relationship. I think I began to listen. She began to listen. And ever since then, I want to say that's probably 20 years ago, 25 years ago, our relationship has been really powerful. When, again, you separate the mothering with the person.
That's what's up, man. One thing that you reminded me of a restaurant. We were at a IHOP. My mom had like I said, she had cancer, and we were in a restaurant. My mom already knew that time was finite. She knew that she wasn't gonna be alive for very much longer. And my mom and I had the realest conversations, and so it was just super authentic, real, where it was just it slapped me in the face. Sometimes I asked the question and I really wasn't prepared for the answer, you know what I'm saying? It was wild. I was sitting there in shock, wanting to cry, you know what I'm saying? It was just it was incredible. There was a lot of healing that came from that conversation, but a lot of trauma that was caused by that, because I was able to hear the truth. So yeah, that was one of those conversations in public where you were just people were probably sitting next to us like,
What's
yo,
happening?
this is really intense and I
Yeah.
just want my omelet right now. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. That is how it felt. But it you know, I as I was hearing you talk and thinking about my own experience, I think there's something so beautiful about that transformational conversation that is so raw. I think when thinking about generational trauma, I feel like that's a step towards it, you know. And I didn't know that that's what I was doing at the time, but after having that conversation with my mom, and she met me halfway, you know what I mean, and she was ready, and I was ready, and that was such a breakthrough. And I don't know, I think I'm really grateful for that moment. It changed my life.
Yeah, for sure, man. I mean, like I said, you walk away from it, maybe hurt, but you rip those scabs off and you finally heal, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
What were some of the things that you saw growing up that you wanted to change?
I feel like I have different answers because I feel like more than one truth can exist at the same time. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that on one hand, I feel like I wouldn't change anything. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I say that is because it wouldn't have led me to where I am now, you know? And I have grown to love me. I love my life. And if I would have changed one little thing about my life, it would have completely changed the whole
like a domino
trajectory,
effect.
You know?
Yeah.
So in that like lens, I wouldn't. But on the other hand, of course, I could have done without all the racism, sexism, the substance abuse, all of the abuse that I experienced, that my family experienced, the generational trauma, like all of those things that are systemic that, you know, that caused me and my family to cope with those ills, those social ills in the negative way, in that toxic way that we did.
Yeah.
You know, I could do with all of that, you know, without all of that, I should say. But yeah, I mean, I learned from all of it, you know, and I think about all my trauma and the journey that it has been and it continues to be, right? Because it's not like I'm healed, yay, you know, but I wear it like a badge of honor, because I'm in the thought space right now, thankful to the healing-centered practices of not defining myself with the trauma that I went through of like, that's something wrong with me, but it's almost like it led me to what is right with me now, what is right with my family.
But yeah, like you talk about like the glass half empty, half full, right? Like you could see it as being like half empty, like, oh my God, like this is what happened in my life. But you could also see it as glass half full,
Exactly.
which is the way that I love to live, because that's the only way that you could see it and improve from it and build from it and like wear it as a badge of honor. Like,
Exactly.
I had to get beat up, or I had to, like, I box. And so when I get beat up in sparring, it's just like, I wear it as a badge of honor because it's just like, I'm gonna be better next time.
Exactly.
This person is not gonna beat me up next time, and it's gonna make me train harder. Now I need to overcome this, and so I think that that's really important. You talked about racism, right? Were there any times in your life that you had to stand up for yourself as a young person?
Oh yeah.
And what was that like?
Oh my gosh, probably countless amounts of time, and I feel like I still do. Yeah, there were. I think. Let me think through this. Coming from Guatemala, and my mom was going back to my mom, and you know, she was she raised other people's children, you know, and she took care of their life so that they could have an easier life, and it's really beautiful work, you know what I mean? You're raising children. There's an education to that, right? Like you're educating them, you're teaching them different languages, different cultural gems, really. So when I would see people treating my mom in such a way that was very, you know, racist, I used to get really upset about it. And like I mentioned before, I was really introverted. But there came a time where I found my voice. And so when I was younger, I was able to study body language and notice all of those things, so that when I became older and I noticed those types of things, I would always kind of question, you know, and be curious. So sometimes when I stand up for myself is through inquiry. is through really asking the questions of people to really reflect upon themselves. Like, what's driving you to do what you're doing right now? Because this is how it's making people feel. And I think I learned that through how people treated my mom when I was growing up. But then also, like, toxic masculinity, that's one of my non-negotiables. So same, that's a very tough boundary that I have of people mistreating others because of their dominance or trying to impose their dominance on other people. So racism, sexism in that way. And then the other thing that I feel like I have and will always kind of interrupt is when people project on their feelings to you or somebody else, like they haven't really processed those things, and so they project it on other people, which
can you give us an example? Like, what would it look like to project somebody?
Just like passive aggression or like people's insecurities, they pass it on to other people. I can't think of a particular example, but when I think about things that really irk me, that really make me feel like I need to stand up for it, those are the things. And growing up, because I didn't have the tools, it would either be of avoidance or anger or, victimization. I'm a very sensitive person, so all those three things would come out. But, going to therapy myself and being a part of healing and transformative work with restorative practices and transformative practices and learning communication skills therapy, you learn to use your words. And so now it's just like, communications skills. Like, I feel this when you do that. Yeah. And I feel like that is a way that works for me.
Yeah, and one thing that I'm really hearing that resonates with me and like everything that you're saying is grace.
Yes.
I think that like with your mom, when you reflected on her upbringing and what was happening and the relationship that you had with her that was tumultuous, when you finally were able to let go, you like found grace for her. So that's something that's like in every level I'm hearing that.
Yeah.
That level of grace and grace for yourself too.
100%.
Because you were talking about that conversation that you had with her at the diner or the restaurant, right? And so it's like you kind of gotta have to you have to forgive yourself in a certain point too, because she was probably coming at you like, well, you did this and this.
Yeah.
And there's no way that you could be like, damn, I didn't know that made you feel that way.
Exactly.
And you got to reflect on yourself and give yourself grace.
And I didn't just wake up learning all of that, right? That was I can speak on that now, thinking back about in my life, but it wasn't always like that. I wasn't always graceful. I wasn't always able to communicate the way that I did. But one of the things that I do give myself grace and props on is that I'm constantly wanting to learn and better myself. Like, I wake up every day, not competing with anybody else, but mostly waking up better every day and doing better than I did the next day, So,
yeah, I mean, for me, that's the only way to live.
Right.
In high school, right? You surrounded yourself by really incredible, powerful women. One of them being my partner, right? Yes. Like, she is an incredible person. How did you meet all these people? Like, and how did you form that crew? Because you had a crew in high school.
I did, yeah.
And that crew was pretty much like what looked from the outside, it looked like the core of Venus.
Sure.
And then it grew from there to like another level of incredible badass women.
Sweet. Yeah. It's a great way of thinking about it. So I grew up when I went to grammar school, the same grammar school that I came, that I talked about with the Guatemalan teacher. I met a lot of my core people there, including my current partner now, and his sister, who was my best friend for many, many years, still is. And I also met another person, Janice. We all went to the same grammar school. So Janice, we all grew up with each other, and I think we would go to each other's houses, celebrate the holidays together. So I think that kind of that core of people started. Janice had a sister as well who was amazing. Anyway, so I used to, because she was my best friend, I used to spend a lot of time with her in Humboldt Park. And I went to Gallery 37, which, back in the day, Gallery 37. I applied for that, which was an art-based thing for inner city kids. And went there for many years, and I met actually someone who was the sibling of Hannah, which is my other really good friend. But they lived really close to Janice, like Humboldt Park area. So I became friends with Hannah's sister, Jessica, and one time we're just hanging out in the neighborhood. Janice came over, and we just created this awesome little bond. And we ended up all going to Lane Tech. And so that's where I met Kasha, at Lane Tech. And being the community person that I was at that time, very social, I saw Kasha and I liked her style. She was actually very quiet to herself, but she was cool, And so I remember one time being like, "Hey, you want to be my friend?" like that,
like that?
Seriously, yeah. And I think I invited her to lunch or something with us, and she came through, and it just was like, we just bonded a lot on. And I can hear and see what you say about her being Zen. She's very grounded, and she always has been. She just brings that groundedness energy to her. And yeah, I mean, I think we were inseparable in high school, the three of us. It was great. Yeah, yeah. And we were so, we talk about this all the time, but we had each other's back so much. Like, we used to get in some risky ass situations, but there was always, like, I always felt safe. Like, I always knew that somebody had my back. And I think we all took turns to do that. We all were experimenting, being teenagers and shit, but we always had each other's back. And I think that that's something that was such a protective factor for all of us.
When I started talking to Kasha, and she was just like, not necessarily showing me the videos, because I don't want to have nightmares. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to see the videos.
That did help.
But,
yes, that does help for sure. 100%.
So she made me aware of the fact that I was like just following everybody.
Yeah.
That's powerful. That like you all had that circle that was like reassuring each other, like, yo, it's cool, man. You don't have to follow that bullshit over there, Like even veganism, like I know that she became a vegan or a vegetarian in high school. Yeah. I know that. Were you plant-based?
Yeah, sure. I started being plant-based when I was 15.
So it was just like early on, like totally. For me, it was just like I was programmed. Yeah. I was programmed by the carne asada, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So was I, but for me, it was, I don't know. It just felt right,
So
yeah, I mean, that was really hard though. For me, yes, I did have my circle of friends who also did not, follow the norms or whatever. My personal story with that is a little difficult. And now that I'm like kind of thinking about it, I'm 41 years old, so there's been a lot of lessons learned, and I'm sure many lessons that I will learn along the way. But I talked about the impact of racism and violence and just abuse in general. There was a point in my life where that became really, really tough for me. It was like I had a very dark moment, probably in high school, and unfortunately, I did not talk about it with my friends. I didn't know how. I didn't feel that we were all going through some stuff. I didn't want to add to it, Yeah. But I came to a point of having a really, really dark time where, trigger warning kind of. It was so dark that you start questioning life, as you were talking about, death is beautiful and whatever. Unfortunately, at that time, I was taking medication. I started seeing a therapist and a psychiatrist. And that medication, because we had Medicaid at the time. So we couldn't afford that medication. I don't know if you're familiar, but, when you can't afford it and you're on Medicaid, they give you the samples. And they give them to you so freely that it's ridiculous. But so I was taking this medication, but this medication was giving me these side effects with a lot of ideation, suicide ideation. And so I did have that moment of thought and even attempt when I was probably like 16 years old. But the thing that came to my mind, because I did take those pills, and the thing that came to my mind was my little sister. My little sister's 12 years younger than me, so she would have been the first person that would have walked into my house. You know what I'm saying? And, you know, witnessed that. And that gave me that purpose to live. And so I went to the bathroom, kind of, you know, threw all of that stuff up. And thankfully, nothing really happened. But ever since that moment when I was 16 years old, and I decided that, you know, I had so many reasons to live, that's where my mindset kind of shifted for me. You know what I mean? Where it was like, I was questioning all these things that didn't feel right, that weren't right, and nobody was talking to me about them, right? Not in school, not in my family, but I noticed that something wasn't right. I had that experience, and then, I don't know, it was like an awakening and a transformation for me to always question things, to have a reason and a purpose to live, to not follow any norm, because life is beautiful and I want to be here, you know?
Yeah.
So it was just kind of like a promise to myself, and I've never looked back. So when we think about being plant-based or all of the ills of living beings, it's like you can't just treat living beings like that. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not going to consume them, nor am I going to treat them like that. That's not the type of life that I want to live. And I've always been intentional ever since that, you know, that other transformative piece.
Mm-hmm. And if you could speak to yourself as a child or a teenager, like what are some of those things that you've kind of learned as an adult, or at this present time that you would tell that young person? You know, like what would you tell young Jessica that would help her develop maybe something that you may have developed now, or something that you're looking forward to develop, but like something that would have given her like a head start?
Part of me wants to answer this question by saying I wouldn't tell myself anything, because I
you
feel
want it to be like,
no,
I wouldn't be who I am.
Right. No. More of like, I think a lot of people with young people, they like speak to them all the time. You know what I mean? They tell them all these gems and whatever. They speak down to them as if they don't have a voice or their own observations or anything. So like the verbal thing, I don't know necessarily, but I think that it would be more energetic, like starting off with a hug or with a gaze that symbolize like I see you, and that symbolize like you're right where you need to be. You know, have patience, and everything's just gonna be as aligned as it is. You know, it's just more of an energetic feel, especially the type of person that I was in high school. Like I had an awakening in a really, really young age. So I was really connected to spirituality and energy work since I can remember. So I always looked for those nonverbal connections with people. So I would have loved to find another elder who could connect with me in that way. So if I were to meet the younger me, that's what I would do, because then it would make me feel like not alone in my gifts.
Yeah, and what was it like to be into that at a young age? You know, like
it was confusing, because I didn't know anybody else who was like me, other than maybe, you know, my friends. But
and what did you call it? Because I can't think of the word. You were like spiritual
through frequency, and I think that that's where I learned there's a frequency type of language. That's what I would call it. I don't know what it's called right now. I'm sure there's a name to it, but it's and I learned this at a really young age of like following my inner compass. So I developed this like inner knowing that if things did not feel right, there was a certain heavy hum that I feel inside of me. And that's when I knew this is not aligned. But if it was aligned with me, it's just this like frequency of air. And I don't know, I wish I could, at some point, one day I'll be able to replicate it. But that's how I kind of just communicated and felt safe with people or situations. It's just through this frequency.
The energy. Like you feel their energy and you're like, man, you got whack energy. I'm not going to hang out with you right now, man. Like,
well, you get to decide, right? Like if it feels uncomfortable, then you get to decide. what you want to do. Yeah.
What was it like to because you went to the Art Institute, you know, my dream. But I was just a knucklehead, man. I was a knucklehead, and my mom didn't have a lot of money.
Yeah.
So that wasn't a good combination, right? Like I was a horrible student. My mom would always go to parent teacher conference, and the teacher would always be like, you know what? Jesus, he's incredibly smart. Like, no lie. And look my mom dead in the eyes and be like, look, dude, this guy is smart, but he doesn't do his homework and he doesn't do his work, and he's getting D's and C's. If he would only try as much as, like I was drawing at the time, right? But before I was rhyming, but if only he would do his work as much as he draws, he would be great. Because you went to the Art Institute. How was that experience for you?
You know, so I got into the arts in probably 6th grade. And going back a little bit about, you know, what a teacher who really changed my life. There was a teacher who changed my life. I was being a rebel. I think it was in 6th grade. We had to do a project. It was a cool project now that I think about it. Painting a bench with a few of my classmates. But that day I decided to be a rebel and be like, I don't want to do that, you know. And I, for the first time, met an adult who did not engage in a power struggle with me. And that changed my life. She said, okay, cool. Well, if you don't want to do that, that's fine. Here's some paper and some charcoal and some, it's like a newspaper clipping. And I was like, okay. And she like sat me somewhere else and was like, go for it. And it was the first time I used those materials. I was like, yes. So I ended up doing all of these wonderful pieces at the time with charcoal. And ever since then, we were kind of inseparable. And so she got me into Marwin, Gallery 37. I ended up going into a bunch of art competitions and would win them, you know, as a kid. So she basically, that moment of me kind of like, you know, pushing boundaries with adults really worked to my benefit. But through that was my love for art. I was just able to release a lot of the hurt and the impact I was talking about of when I realized all of that stuff that had affected me at a young age. I was able to get all of that out in art. And so I just knew that I wanted to go to the Art Institute. There was no doubt in my mind. I was driven. I was going to get in there, and that's it. My mom didn't have money. I didn't know what I was doing, but I got myself in, you know. And I actually got in by I don't know what they called it, but it was like a media decision. So you would go and show your portfolio and make a case for it in front of like a bunch of
like a panel
of people, and I got in.
Yeah, they would give you the thumbs up or they would give you the thumbs down.
And I remember their comments are like, you know, you still need a lot of like work, but like your passion and your color is what's going to get you in. So they're like, check, you're in. And I was like, word. But the experience was difficult, to be honest. I was a Chicago public kid, you know, going into a private kind of institution was really rough.
Yeah.
Because it was I was surrounded by other people who were rich, you know. Privileged. Most of them had a lot of money. They weren't going through the struggles that I was. I took out loans upon loans to get there. It took me 6 years to graduate, whereas other people would graduate in 4, like, you know. And then my experience there was very much, it was tough. You know, I began to question a lot of things. It was a lot about like who you know, and it was all about ego. I felt, this is my lived experience, and you know, I don't want to talk bad about any institution necessarily, even though that was my experience. But yeah, and then you know, you have critiques, and a lot of my critiques were at that time felt very racist, where they would be like, you know, well, it's too colorful. You need to narrow it down. It's like, but this is part of my culture, and this is part of the way I want to express myself. So there was so many limitations coupled with money, coupled with ego that I just really rejected. And going back to my frequency and hum, it just was like a very hard no. So I ended up finding art therapy in my undergrad. And when I took a class called art and psychology or something, or art and spirituality. That's what it was. And I just fell in love.
That sounds pretty cool, man.
It was really beautiful. And the professor was an incredibly amazing elder who I learned a lot from, because he talked about the process versus the product. And it was like my hum of like, this is it for me, came through. And so I just, I was driven. And so you're not allowed to take a lot of like master level classes in your undergrad, especially with art therapy, because there's no bachelor's for that. But I found myself just pleading my case, I guess, to a bunch of the professors there. And I got into maybe like 4 classes that were geared to more of art therapy. And I think that just changed my trajectory of art and what it meant for me. It was more of a healing space. It healed a lot of my childhood trauma. And so I really will say that came from the Art Institute. As a matter of fact, Venus Collective came out of the Art Institute as well.
I was about to ask you about that. Do you want to make that connection? So my question was like, what was the driving force in Venus, and what was the mission and vision of that collective, and what were the events like? What did you want to? Yeah. Like, if you can describe the events.
Sure. So the inspiration came from a lot of art history classes, and seeing women and just the artists and the history books were all about the depiction of women weren't like the women artists, but it was the depiction of women who were being objectified, right? Yes. You see a lot of naked women who are just there as a prop. And it came to a point where I just really rejected that. And I didn't learn too much other than Frida Kahlo probably at the time. That really stood out to me. It wasn't part of the art history that I was learning that I wanted to learn. So I was like, you know what? And at that time we did have the flower shop. It was called Atmospheres. And so we were trying to have some events there. So that was actually our first gallery show. It was an inspiration. I was like, well, what if I just change the narrative here, and we just highlight all of these women artists that I connected with at the Art Institute. And so we tried out this mini gallery show at Atmospheres that really blew up, 1 year became 3 years, became 5 years, and then it got into the Venus Collective. That was just like multifaceted and multidimensional in the sense of not only visual art. And the idea was based on continuing the efforts of our feminists for mothers. When we think about the feminist waves, we wanted to continue that, but do it in our way in Chicago. We wanted to be at the forefront of everything, like you mentioned, from security guards to the DJs. And when we thought about arts, we thought about them in a not just one-dimensional way. And it became really powerful being around a lot of women. And then the other really beautiful thing that we were all grounded by was it was all donation based, right? But a lot of the money that we gathered, we would give to other organizations. And that was really important to all of us, that it was a cause. We wanted to not only highlight and uplift women and people who identified as women artists, to give them their space, to give them their time to shine when they weren't allowed to most of the time. You didn't see that at the time. But also to make these efforts and raise money for organizations that are doing, great things for the community. Because I went to the Art Institute, there wasn't many classes that I could take on gender and women's studies or anything like that. That didn't happen until later on. I picked up my own books, but I started seeing all of this, and I was like, this is not working for me. I know that there's more to this, and I started questioning things. And I think with those inquiries back to inquiry, then I started learning, and that's what happened with the Venus Collective. It was, let's change that narrative. And I found myself partnering with other women who did go into the gender and women's studies and learning together and disrupting all this narrative. And I think that was what was so groundbreaking about Venus Collective, is that that we did that unapologetically, through the arts. And yeah, we did that from 2004 to, I want to say, 2010. And it became so powerful because it went beyond just having these gallery art liberatory spaces, really, to us creating like the Venus Collective, which was like a support group for us, where we taught each other, we learned, we reflected on our identities, our multiple identities. We created a safe space for all of us to be us. And yeah, I will always have such fond memories of that time in my life. I think, it changed my life too. A lot of the things that I'm saying changed my life.
So the Venus Collective eventually ended.
Yeah.
What was it like ending something so powerful?
It wasn't, to be honest, I don't remember like the day that I was like, no, it's not going to happen. Right. It just gradually, what ended up happening, I think now when I think of it, is we grew up and we all had full-time jobs. All of us that I can remember were educators at the time, or working in the community. So became parents, got married, whatever the case may be. And I think that it just progressively kind of, our lives shifted a little bit. So, and it was a lot of work. We weren't getting paid for it necessarily, we were a 501c3, so we were raising funds, and it was a lot of work. But what's so beautiful now that I think about it is that how committed and passionate we were. Like, this was a priority for all of our lives. And we really made time for it. But I think, like certain things just, I ran their course. And I think that, actually, I know that it started a lot of people's career, or continued their career, whether it be through the arts or education, or social justice.
Put that battery in them.
100%. Yeah. All of the artists are doing some amazing stuff right now. So
yeah. And how does it feel to like know that the Venus Collective was part of that? Do you feel a sense of pride? You're just like, or gratitude?
Yeah, I think both of those things. I wouldn't say because of the Venus Collective people are who they are, right? But I would say that it definitely added to it. And so, yeah, there's a lot of gratitude. There's a lot of inspiration that I still, every time I look at pictures or think about it, or when we all get together and like go back down memory lane, there's a part of me that just feels inspired and feels the sense of responsibility to not end it. The Venus Collective ended as far as that version of it, but I think it continues on in other ways. And
then just curious, like, what was it like to be in a room where there were all these incredible, powerful women, and like, you're an introvert? And so you're trying to manage these personalities, right? These like, what was it like to be in a room where like everybody was looking at you?
For sure.
Right? Like, what we gonna do?
Right.
And so you're just like, you gotta assume something in yourself to like
be able to do that.
Yeah. What was that like?
Well, it was tough because we were anchored in participatory action at that time. So my thing was learning that, and I learned through others of there was no hierarchy there. It was really a spiral effect, a circle. It was a collective. So no one person made the rules. And when I tried really hard, we all tried really hard to really live by that philosophy, but that's really hard sometimes, because you do need a leader, and you do need someone to step up in certain places. But personally, I wanted to see it through in the participatory piece. I wanted everyone to have a voice, and I wanted us to get to a consensus, and I think we all did. There was just times that somebody needed to step up. So that was a little tough because everybody was really smart and had a lot of ideas and opinions, but we made it work. So it was there were moments of intensity, but I think that I learned so much about myself and about leadership in that way. And I learned what kind of leader I wanted to be and what kind of leader I didn't want to be.
What did you discover?
I discovered that I really do believe in participatory action, and I really do believe that people can work together. It's not easy, but you just kind of have to stick with it. I learned that my leadership style is very community based. I also learned that at some points I do have to step up and show up in my own authentic self, which I think I did there and then too. So I just became more confident in that type of leader, and I think it's worked to my advantage because it's different. To be honest, we live in a very patriarchal world, and I think that ego and that type of leadership, and don't get me wrong, I have a very, very good relationship with my masculine. So there's no diss on that part at all. So I can be in my own authority, so to speak. But it does not mean that what I say goes. What that means to me and that type of leader is that I'm going to speak my mind and be my authentic self. I'm going to have off days. I'm going to have good days. I'm going to have amazing ideas or some ideas that stink, and that's fine. And that everybody should show up that way. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's the type of leader that I am. I do demand that kind of presence, though. Like, everybody has to come correct in their own authentic, unapologetic way.
Yeah. I mean, that must have been really powerful in those rooms. Yeah. So you were working in schools. If you could briefly describe like the capacity that you were working in schools.
Sure. So my capacity in schools, I love working with youth, alongside youth. And I've been doing that for such a long time. And my biggest teacher was that art teacher that I just talked about, right? Who did not engage in that power struggle, who saw me and gave me some paper and charcoal and said, do you, I was always inspired by that. And I think I always tried to like imitate that.
What was her name? Do you remember?
I remember her first name. It was Ushma, but I don't remember her last name. She was an Indian woman who was just so authentic and amazing. Yeah. Word.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's cool that you remember her first name. Like usually it's like the last name that you remember. So that's interesting. That's
right?
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Would like to unpack that.
Like Miss Torres, or you know what I'm saying? Like,
it was Ushma. I remember Ushma.
That's a cool name too.
Yeah. That's cool. But so with youth, I've done everything from case manager to advocate to teacher, not like a CPS teacher, but I'm saying like teaching certain skills, social, emotional, mostly in the behavioral and mental health, restorative practices, discipline.
What happened when you were working at a school and you were just like, what was that light bulb that came into your head? Was it a conversation that you had with Fausto? Was it like conversations that you were having? Was it just like, man, we could do this, man? Like these people are wanksters over here trying to do this. They're trying, and so I won't diss people who are like companies and like corporations that are trying to go into the schools and like really trying to improve them. A lot of the people who are doing that or who are the driving force of that aren't community connected. And so you get some washed down like interaction that you have with children or that you have with kids. And so one of the things that I see is that you come from it, right? Yeah. And there's a power of like going back and like affirming those kids too. Because it's just like, yo, I look like you. Yeah. We went through the similar experiences. Right. Like, this is what I learned.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's been, I think it didn't just happen from one day to the next. This has been a long time coming. But once I realized that, well, you gain confidence too after doing something for a really long time, and waking up every morning excited to go to work. I like working with youth always feeds me, and I learn so much from them, and it's a very reciprocal kind of career passion of mine. But I realized that a lot of the things that I was doing was representing a company which I learned so much from. But I was also, this was my brand, you know, and I was my brand, so to speak, of like, I was showing up with the ideas. I had the flexibility to do so too, which is why, one of the reasons why I do love the company that I was in and the non-for-profit that I was in. But once I started realizing like, hey, I don't have to work for them. It's me coming in every day and providing these services.
Yeah, you're bringing it to the table and they're the one that are selling it to everybody.
Exactly. So, you know, I just started realizing that, and I was like, okay. So Fausto, and you know, with my experience with Venus Collective and Leftist Lounge and just like community organizing stuff, I was like, you know, this is something that I really want to work towards. So it wasn't from one day to the next that all of it happened. We've been working and been very intentional about it, right? So at first, of course, my impulsivity was like, fuck it, I want to quit my job and do this now. But there's a lot of, you know, you have to be an adult about it. And I worked really hard. Like, that's where I went to grad school. You know, I have 2 master's degrees. I went to grad school again to get my license for mental health, because that's also something that I could do. And I, you know, ever since then, we've been dreaming and, you know, thinking through it and how we are going to do it. So everything that we have done has been working towards this dream, and it's just been happening. Fausto was the first one to take that leap of, you know, quitting his job and getting everything prepared and settled to do that. And, you know, I gave myself 10 years to be done, and in July it'll be my 10th year. So I will be transitioning, but I didn't want to leave, like, again, out of impulse without having something. And now we do. We have 2 companies, and I'm ready to step in. And thankfully, we do have partners and community members who are working towards the same mission and the goal that we are. And they've been doing too. So it's a lot of alignment that is happening, but it's been intentional, you know?
And what do you do? Like, what would you describe your work as?
Well, the Praxis Institute was inspired by the name Praxis, which integrates theory and practice. It's a few folks who have been in the field for a really long time, worked in organizations, have done a lot of their own self-work. And we work with youth-facing organizations or organizations that fund youth programs, with capacity building, with trainings, with pro-Indigenous, pro-Black, anti-racist work, and centered around healing-centered practices. And again, like I said, just like capacity building. So in one sense, it's very much helping the helper, the people that are doing the work, just kind of, working alongside them and learning from each other. And if we have to, like, training, best practices or whatnot. So again, it's the theory and practice of things. Fausto's background and my background, and actually everybody, our partners are in youth development. So that has been really helpful. But Fausto also has a background in research and evaluation. So, and most of us have done youth-facing work, community-based work. So again, it just was in alignment. All of them kind of quit their jobs and joined forces. And I'm still working in my position, but it was an idea that Fausto and I had been kind of like marinating for a really long time. I knew I wasn't going to take the leap just yet, but we did get this offer that kind of expedited everything. So that's where we opened up our LLC. And then we brought in, we didn't bring them in, but it just was aligned that 2 other of our partners joined, and they were working for themselves anyway. So it was just perfect alignment. Mm-hmm. And then Kindred is like a more direct service project where it's a lot of the work that I do currently, which is arts and wellness. So it's an integration of arts and wellness. So it's more about the direct practice work, but it's really community based. I am really inspired by making art accessible to people, for a really long time with my experience with the Art Institute, where anytime you tell people that you went to SAIC, they're like, oh my God, I wish, you know what I mean? Because it was not accessible. It was not accessible. It was a lot of money. And to get into art classes, that's a lot of money, people go get their nails done, go to yoga, and that's their self-care. But art has always been this elitist kind of thing, which I want to change the narrative about that. So the accessibility piece is really important to me.
Especially now they're cutting all the art programs.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's definitely social, right? Like it's definitely something that the have-nots do not have, and the haves get an abundance of.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, that's a incredible mission that you have.
Thank you. And, all of these things are things that that I experienced, right? That were healing for me, that I have walked down the path. And that's what makes it so aligned for me. And so I wake up every morning being excited about doing that stuff, and I feel confident about doing it. And it's the right time for me to step out of, working my 9 to 5 and doing it for myself and for the people alongside.
So you have like a determination. Do you ever have like get a little bit of a cold feet where you're just like, oh my God, I'm programmed to, I need a job. I need health insurance. Like I need all these things. And so kind of like coaching, do you ever coach yourself through that? And it's just like, yo, we're going to do this no matter what. Like it's going to have to happen. Yeah.
I mean, I think, like I said, it's been a long time coming. So this was like Praxis. The Praxis Institute is about to be 4 years old. We had the LLC and it's been working. But prior to this, I think we were thinking about Praxis for 5 years prior to that, and there was a lot of fear there until a point where, we just felt more confident. Like once you plant that seed and you want to do it, that's all you think about. And when you're into your 9 to 5 and you're like doing a presentation or doing whatever it is you are doing, you realize like, wait, I could be doing this for myself. So I put myself in that place of like, smelling it, totally visualizing all my senses, and little by little, it just became actualized. I started manifesting it, and the practicality part did come through too, like saving money, being really smart about creating that foundation for yourself has been really helpful too. So now I don't have the cold feet. I think it's a bittersweet thing after giving so many years to, the organization I work for now, because I'm not in a place where I hate it. You know what I mean? I'm in a place where I'm super grateful for it because it taught me a lot of things. And I don't know, I have a very beautiful experience in that organization. So that's the bittersweet part of like being like, yeah, like I'm gonna this part of my life is gonna eventually, like, it's gonna die, and I'm not gonna be able to walk into this place and see these people in the same way. Yeah, there's gonna be a loss there. So a part of me is like getting prepared for all of that, but I'm really excited about it.
And then what advice would you give a young person that was like any advice that you would give somebody that wants to work with the community, that wants to work with art, that has like an interest, or just even somebody your age, right? Like it doesn't have to be an ageist question. It could just be like somebody that's like, man, I could do this myself.
Exactly.
That realization where you kind of like, you, like I said, like you look at how everybody's kind of following the same path, and you're just like, wait, there's another lane over there?
Exactly. I think, honoring the fact that we are multifaceted beings, and really thinking about that in the sense that when we think about a career or school or whatever, we put all of our eggs in one basket, and we have a lot of gifts and a lot of strengths, but most of the time we only work one muscle, so to speak. And my advice would be to hone in on all your passions and work on them all, not all at once, but like don't forget about the other parts, right? So you are working for whatever organization, or you are going to school for whatever craft. There's more to you than that. So don't forget about the other things, because you just never know when your path is going to divert. And I think that most of the time, especially in our generation, I don't know necessarily this generation, they're very, very intelligent, and I think have caught on to that. So I feel like they can teach me some stuff, right? But I think that the way that I grew up in my generation was like, you want to stay in a job for X amount of years.
Yeah, they're seeing those other lanes.
Yeah, they are seeing all those lanes, and they're just like, yep, I'm going to be in this job for a year, but then I'm also going to do this on the side, and da-da-da. So I would say continue doing that, because you know, a lot of people don't know who you are or haven't heard of your services because you've been focused on only one thing. So kind of expand and feed all your facets, all your dimensions.
Thank you
so much
for coming.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for sharing your story. I'm positive that you're gonna inspire people, because we're programmed, and once you figure out that we're programmed, and that you kind of need to step outside that programming, you know, you start seeing possibilities that you didn't see before.
Yep.
And so when we talked about it, I know that we were at Millennium Park, and I was just like, yo,
yeah,
I'm peeping your style out. Like, you seem to be on some other type of journey that not everybody's on. And so I was just like, yo, I honor that, right? Like, you know, everybody has gifts to share. And I think that what you're doing, and even whenever we meet, like, I know you're working on yourself.
Yep.
Right. And I don't know if you feel that about me, but I'm constantly trying to work on myself and make myself a better person. And so, like, go through those traumas and like really figure out, like, one of those things that did that for me was art therapy, believe it or not.
Yep.
You know, my mom told me that I was adopted when I was, I would say like 8, 9, 10, around there. It was during the time that I was going to get my first communion. You know, I thought everything was fine until I started speaking to family members, and my family members, my mom's out here, obviously. But family members were like, bro, you took it hard. You know what I'm saying? Like, you took it hard. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I remember my life being rosy and petally, and like, I was frolicking through the clouds. She was like, nah, dog, you took it hard. Your mom. And then it makes sense, because then I was going to art therapy. And that's when I really figured out the value of therapy, especially in our community, or I'll speak for Mexican communities. And I think across the board in communities of color, like, we definitely don't talk about therapy as being a healing process. Like, we think that when you're going to therapy, it's because you're crazy.
Right.
It's because you've reached your limit, like you're weak. And so I think that there's a lot of things that happen in your mind, a lot of triggers, a lot of connections that you have in your mind that you have to like come to terms with.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that, you can't just like rip off that scab and just be cool with it, because then it could fester, right? Like, you have to have guidance, and like, you know, the therapist, I don't know, because I'm not a therapist, but like, my therapists have always asked me questions at the right moment where it's just like, they don't give me everything.
Right.
And I think sometimes they could just be like, look, man, you just got to do this, and you'll be healed.
Right.
That's to say that therapy works.
You know, I think it does. But I also, at the same time, think that it doesn't work for everybody. And I think it's something important to say. A few things is that mental health and psychology was kind of, a lot of the things that we do follow are through white supremacy and patriarchal thoughts and, you know, findings. All of the people that brought, you know, a lot of the popular psychology that we know are white males. And so I think that narrative of you only go to therapy when you're crazy comes from somewhere. So I always kind of value that thought. Of course, that's not true, right? But that did come from somewhere. So I think one of my other purposes in life is to kind of disrupt that and change that narrative as well. Because healing comes from all types of things. You know, if we kind of honor our indigenous roots too. It's like healing is through so many things. So talk therapy is one of them for sure, but it doesn't have to be, and it doesn't work for everybody, which is, I think, is probably why I gravitate towards the arts as well and holistic healing, because it's not a one size fits all. And then also realizing where it came from. I think it's important for people to also question it. So, there's a space for all perspectives, I think. And then the other thing I was going to say is that the idea of kindred also came from something you talked about, is like you encounter people that you talk to who, when you're around them, you start realizing are inspired by them, of their healing process, of, their background, like things were tough for us, but somehow you have found that drive to continue to heal. And even if you're not in that space, you're open to connecting to other folks, back to that frequency piece. Like when you were talking about our conversation in Millennium Park and just our connection in general, it reminded me of the other piece of Kindred, is to put that energy out there, and whoever comes is supposed to be there. And that really inspires me, and I hope that continues.
And that's really what we're trying to do with this podcast, because it's not just me. It's Kasha.
Sure, yeah.
Kasha Sanchez and Jesus Sanchez that are doing this together, right? Like she's incredibly important in like the editing process, the guests, like the thoughtfulness. Like this is not something that I thought up and I was like, we're going to do this. No, it was like a conversation, like the conversations that you've had with Fausto when we were talking about like building. And so, you're very inspiring. Thank you for coming to the 500 and Growing podcast. It's really for that purpose.
Yes.
For people to be inspired, for people to hear stories that may be like theirs or may not be like theirs.
Right.
And for them to know that, you got to believe in yourself.
Yep.
And that you don't have to follow that lane. You could look at other lanes and figure out a way to do it. Just do it intelligently. And then how can people reach out to you if they wanted, some professional development, or they wanted to get in contact with like Kindred and like the community-based work that you do? Like, how can people reach you?
So we have a website for Praxis Institute, which is www.praxisinstitute.com. And then for Kindred, it's www.kindredhealingspirit.com. And then, of course, we also have Instagram. So look at us or look out for us at the Praxis Institute, and then Kindred Healing Spirits. Yeah,
and we'll have the links at 500andgrowing.com. And then we'll also spell it out as far as any posts that we have.
Sweet.
We'll put it on there.
Cool. Word.
All right. Well, thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much.
500 and growing.
Podcast. Dedicated to the underdog, cause I see you. Working on your craft, getting strong, cause I see you. Ready to set it off and on, cause I see you. Correcting all that is wrong, cause I see you. Dedicated to your craft, read and study the math. Making goals and taking a stand. Original, so you trailblaze a path. In tune with your inner master plan.
Visit 500andgrowing.com for more creative content.
Thank you very much for listening to the 500 and Growing podcast. Remember that we have incredible guests that have already featured in episodes in the past. So please go back into the archives and listen to their inspirational stories. And then remember that we have incredible guests lined up for the future. So please follow on Instagram at 500 and Growing Podcast. Remember to follow on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any of the major podcast platforms. You can also check out 500andgrowing.com for more creative content.
500 and growing.
Podcast.